Hi, welcome to this week's episode of the Wellbeing Show. I've got a fantastic guest who's joining us from Canada, and I've forgotten whereabouts in Canada, but she can tell me soon. Her name's Susie. She hasn't put a second name on there, so I'm dreadful. I'm tired. I'm an old man. It's Friday night, and my brain is going, but she's going to fill in all those gaps. What I do know is that she's a yogi. And we were talking just before the show about the importance of exercise, in particular for health, not just physical health, but emotional and mental health. So we're going to be diving into some of that stuff and some really fascinating research that's been produced in the UK looking at yoga's role in helping men with depression, which was really interesting. New research that's just come out. Um, but we'll be looking also in some depth about the particular form of yoga that Susie is working in and looking at how it helps with relaxation, which is another word for stress management. And stress management being one of the four corners of a healthy life. So that's enough of an introduction from me. Just to let you know, if you have any questions, ping me on WhatsApp 07506 319 745. Don't call me, even though it looks live. It's not. It's pre-recorded. I'll probably be in bed when this goes out. So don't call me. Just send me a message and I'll sort of respond to you when I wake up. Because remember, I'm an old man these days. I need my sleep, folks. So enough of that. Over to Susie. Welcome. How are you doing?
Thanks so much for having me. This is really fun.
Oh, it's great. I mean, I should say I did apologize to Susie before because she was meant to be on last week, and I then had some sort of work thing I had to deal with, and like a good egg, she's turned up again and given me a second chance. So I'm very
Yeah,
grateful for that. Thank you for doing that. How are things?
that's
Scott, fill in those gaps. Firstly, whereabouts in Canada? What's your second name, and what's the form of yoga that you do? So I'm just
all
you.
right. So I am Susi Hately
Yeah.
and I live in Calgary, Alberta, Canada. So right kind of in sort of the left of middle, if you're looking at the map, if you are familiar with the states, and just above Montana.
Yeah.
Sky is just as big. And I utilize yoga in a very therapeutic way. So I've got a bachelor's degree in kinesiology. So from a very body based exercise physiology base and biomechanics. And then I started to apply that with people who are in pain. And then I got into yoga and it's just sort of gone from there. I've been doing this now for, which is kind of blows me away, for 30 years now. And really the focus is on supporting people and helping people reduce and eradicate physical pain.
Yeah.
But as we know, like a lot of times this entry into the body opens up a whole host of other realizations and awarenesses, which are paramount really for people to help them in recovery.
Yeah, and also particularly in pain. I mean, I've got a specialist physio who does work on pain, but it works
Yeah.
very much with us psychologically because a lot of the work around pain management, and particularly chronic pain management,
Yeah.
as you know, involves emotional safe spaces and supportive relationships with people and a long-term view of what that means. It's not on or off. It's about all sorts of things. So we'll get into that. That's really interesting. I hadn't really read that part of your profile. So I think chronic pain is really interesting, particularly
Yep.
in our context
Yep.
because of the overuse of medication
Yep.
and the dreadful problems that produces. So sort of like, and the need for, we have things like pain clinics in the UK, which look at that issue and have sort of, but if you look at somewhere like the US, I don't know if it's true in Canada as well, but there was the over prescription of painkillers
Yep.
producing what they call is the opioid crisis over there,
Yep.
which I don't know if that happened in Canada. Certainly didn't happen here and in Europe because we just don't prescribe in that way. But what was the experience in Canada? Was it similar type of thing or?
Well, it was I wouldn't say it's similar because it was just so much more exploded in the US. There was a lot of hotspot centers in the US. I would say that it's been still an issue for sure.
Yeah,
But not to the same degree. Yeah.
right. Okay. Well, that's really interesting. We're going to get into that. But first of all, are you practicing where you grew up? Is this the part of the world that you grew up in?
Mm-mm. No, I grew up in Toronto and I went to school in Victoria, and that was mostly out of a desire to move to British Columbia and
Yeah.
live there. And so I thought that was a great way to get out there. And then funnily enough, I found my way into I started my career in Vancouver and then sort of got a bit tired of Vancouver and found my way over to Calgary and have been here since I was about 26, 27 years old.
Right. And so
Yeah,
how did you, well, I mean, I'm interested in people's backgrounds because of what
sure.
they do for a living. But it's also, I find it interesting what the influences are on how people get into healing and why they get into healing and what their roots are, because they're always very interesting. So, I mean, in terms of your family, were they a traditional Canadian family? I don't even know what that is, but your stuff.
Good question. I you know what? I don't know how I got here in
Yeah.
some ways. I was always the kind of person in my family who was a feeler. I was more of the sensor and intuitive type, whereas I have three other siblings, and they are all very kind of prefrontal cortex, logical thinkers, lawyers, accountants,
Mhm.
foreign investment traders, like so very much on that side of their brain. There were a lot of around the table dining room conversations. My dad was a lawyer, my mom was a nurse. So there was lots of like that kind of very logical conversation, which I didn't love, because with logical conversation often came with argument, and sometimes the argument got a bit heated. And
Yeah.
I found myself more like, can't we just get along? Like, do you really need this? But it's interesting because I can see where some of my thought processing
Yeah.
and how I analyze things comes from that background. But it's interesting because I was always very active and always interested in competition when I was younger. And I remember thinking about like what I was going to do when I went to university, and I kind of opened up the catalog and was like, I don't know. And then I saw anatomy. I'm like, ooh, that looks kind of cool. So that's kind of how I didn't really have like a grand vision when
Yeah.
I first went to school. It just was like, that course looks cool, and what else might I do?
I'd say by school, do you mean the way the Americans call school? We would call it college or university.
Well, yeah, so university. So when I finished high school, then I went to university. Yeah. And that's when I was like, okay, I guess this is what I'll do. Yes.
What did you choose at university? You chose a, what,
So
your
I
training or something? It was
so I ended up doing I started with I saw this anatomy course, and I actually couldn't take it because I had to be in a kinesiology program in order to take the anatomy.
yeah.
And so I was like, how do I get into that program? And that program required basic sciences. So I started in the basic science realm, and then after I completed the basic science, then I applied for the kinesiology program, and then I got my anatomy course and did all the physiology, biomechanics, and
So tell
stuff.
us about kinesiology, what that is, so people who don't know
Sure.
that term.
So the I did a bachelor of science, and it's the study of human movement
Okay.
and all things of movement. So that includes exercise physiology, biomechanics, and what we call motor control and coordination. And what motor control and coordination are is, if you think about, I often use the analogy of an orchestra, and you have all the parts of the orchestra: violin, viola, saxophone, oboes, drums, all the things. And so each of those things are mechanisms. And then the mechanisms are brought together in a coordinated way to create melody and music. So motor control is really how's the mechanism working? And
Okay.
then motor coordination is how does it all coordinate? So I'm looking at like, how does the arm bone move in the shoulder socket? How does the leg bone move in the hip socket? How are muscles firing or not firing? That's like the motor control mechanistic piece.
Yeah.
And then it's like, well, how does all of this come together to create a coordinated whole? And with people with pain, oftentimes there's an issue in the control and in the coordination. So I help to improve those pieces of it in a therapeutic way to help people get those
So
back online.
what was it that interested you about that? How was it? I mean, it seems, given your background, stuff like that, this logical, go-getter, high-achieving family, and then you see kinesiology. What was it that grabbed you about that? I'm sort of intriguing. I mean, I know your mum was a nurse, so maybe the medical stuff was there, or she had some sort of medical training. But
It was
was
that
it
anatomy
did they
course.
see the trail on the donkey, or did something stand out for
It
you?
was the anatomy course. Like, it's when I opened the catalog and I'm like, ooh, I want to take that anatomy course. I had to go
Right.
into that school to take the anatomy course.
And so you were just fascinated by the human body or something. How funny. How
Yeah, and I
interesting.
was kind of drawn to it. Like, that was sort of like when I talk about my sensing intuitive self, it was like, ooh, this is
Wow.
the thing I need to do. And so I was like, all right, how do I get there? How do I do that? Yeah.
Right. And,
Yeah.
and when you look back on it, So what is it about the anatomy that sort of drew you in, do you think, now? If I answer that question now, some years later, I'm sure the answer's changed over the years.
That's a really, really, really great question. It gets interesting when you think about the word anatomy, because when you look
Ah,
at the root of the anatomy, it's called
yeah.
to cut. And
It's called the
and
cut.
to cut, yeah, because that's what anatomists did. They cut up
Okay.
and
Yeah.
dissected a
Okay.
body.
Wow, I didn't know
And
that. That's fascinating.
and what's also interesting about that process is they just cut. And that's how we created the shape of muscles. Because before you cut, it's just a human body. Everything is just kind of like in there. And when you look at pretty anatomy pictures, they have all these lovely, pretty lines, but that's actually not what it looks like.
That's they cut the skin and opened it up to look at it. Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then they've kind of made, okay, well, this one's going to be the pec major, and this one's going to be the rectus abdominis, and this one's going to be the glutes, and this one's like, so it's when I learned that, I found that really fascinating that it was just sort of, there was sort of an arbitrariness to the process when they first, when the forefathers of the day got into to looking at what was under the skin. And but I always found myself very drawn to um like as I got into learning about it, so beyond the intuitive pull, as I got into learning about it, I recognized there was a lot that I could understand just about a human by understanding the way the body moved. And and I remember being with a study partner in one of my classes, and I said, I think if I understood all of like how these muscles really function, and the opposing muscles and the supportive muscles, and just how it all happens, I think we could solve a lot of pain problems. And I remember saying that to him, and I'm like, where is that even coming from? But that's ultimately what I've done with my clientele, right? I'm not a physical therapist. I'm not a massage therapist. I don't have a scalpel. I don't have needles like an acupuncturist.
Mhm.
I really have my ability to see the way someone moves and then help them kind of feel into their bodies to to feel it in for themselves. And so I've developed a really great ability to see the way someone moves. And over the years, I can even though I can't say that's exactly the muscle that's working, because you can't do that with your eyes, there's just an understanding of how things function under the skin
Mm.
that the anatomy gave me.
It's
Yeah.
fascinating. I mean, what I'm thinking of is there's a couple of things. There is a massage therapist I know.
Yeah.
She's also a physio, but she works very much with what's that sort of gel stuff that holds our muscles in? What's that called? The
Like the
fast.
fascia. Yeah. The fascia.
And
Yeah.
she massages that, and she
Yeah.
works around trauma and the release of trauma. And she's very much about, well, it's held. You can do
Yes.
loads of work with your body, but if you don't work with the fascia. And
Yeah.
I'm also thinking about some of the dance movement therapists that I've worked with, who will literally watch somebody walk across a room and diagnose them. I will sit there like this going, no, I'm not telling you anything. I get very self-conscious, but they're quite extraordinary. Are you able to do that sort of
Yeah.
thing? You're looking at somebody, you're going, I think that's what's going on, and that's what's
Yeah.
happening, and this is how they're feeling.
Yeah.
Wow, I mean, that's quite an extraordinary skill. I hope you know how to turn it off as well, so you could say at the
Yeah, over the years I've had to, right? It
yeah,
really is
right,
a
exactly.
cocktail conversation killer, right? When
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
when you can see what's
Can you
going
imagine
on.
being like therapists in those situations?
Yes,
I'm very
yes,
much like, I've got a stock joke, which is not unless you give me X amount of money. And so
yes,
it usually shocks people. Not particularly. But
yeah,
I do remember when I first qualified, being fascinated by people wanting to tell me everything. And then I quickly got really bored of that, of those
yeah.
people in the bars going, I've never told anybody this before, but, and I'd be like, just don't tell me. That's okay.
It's awesome.
Go find somebody else to talk to about it. I'm there
Yeah.
to relax. So I mean it is quite a significant skill. And I can see why you're interested in it now. Was that the plan initially? I mean, because there's an obvious metaphor, isn't there? That you're in terms of being an anatomist, if you like, you're trying to get under the skin. And that's how the profession came about. And that metaphor is very familiar to us about like emotional process. They just got under my skin. They've really upset me. Or we get under the skin of something because we want to understand what's happening inside.
Mhm.
Is that was that what you were drawn to? You think that was your intuition was like, I really want to understand what's going on inside. This surface isn't enough for me.
I'm not I'm not sure. I'm not sure that I can say that specifically, but what I can say is when I completed my degree and I was sort of pondering what's next, do I go to the traditional route of medicine, OT and PT and I got a job at a chronic pain center, and one of the PTs who was there, she's like, "Don't do it. Don't. You think out of the box way too much than those professionals do." And I was like, "What do you mean by that?" She goes, "Just believe me, don't do it." And I'm
Yeah.
like, "Okay." I'm like, "Okay." And she was, I had a ton of respect for her, and and I just kind of kept on my merry way. And I had found yoga at that time. I had pain myself,
Yeah.
and I found yoga, and I got out of pain doing yoga, and I started to integrate the yoga with the traditional stuff that we were doing at the clinic, and people got better quicker. And I'm like, okay, this is crazy.
Yeah.
When
Yeah. Yeah.
we integrate these two things, something cool is happening. But I'm young, I'm excited, and I'm like blown away at the same time. And then I look around and I'm like, okay, where are the yoga teachers making money here? I don't know if I could do this as a living. So then I sort of kept it off to the side, but I kept learning and I got my teacher training, and I started delving into other aspects of rehabilitation. And I did
Mhm.
a stint as a disability case manager and got to know the insurance industry pretty well, which I did not stay there very long, but I learned a ton about it and helped a lot of people actually.
Yeah.
But then when I started teaching classes in yoga, so here I'm still doing this other stuff and I'm teaching classes in yoga. Um, and I started to become this pain magnet. Like just everybody coming to my basic classes all had pain. And I'm like, this is crazy. And I started to see, you know what? Like if I teach the movement this way and this way and this way, it's
Mhm.
interesting. I'm noticing their pain's going down. And I just started to see the success.
Mhm.
And then it just sort of snowballed from there. And there I was. And it was one of those like in the right place at the right time. And I just put the gas on it, not knowing I was putting the gas on it. It was all very, very organic is how I got there.
The connection with pain, was that because you were experiencing chronic pain? That's what drew you to it, or was it prior to that? Because you said it happened in college as well.
Right. When I was in BC, that's when I got my first job, and that's when I had found yoga. I got myself out of pain, and then I left that job in BC, did some traveling, and then when I came back, I'm like, I think I'm going to give Calgary a shot. So I
Yeah.
moved to Calgary, and then that's when I was working with disability case management and still doing yoga on the side. And I thought I would never get back into the whole pain world because there were some pieces about it that I didn't really like. I don't exactly remember what those were, but I don't I just remember saying to my teacher, she goes, "You should work with people in pain." I'm like, nah, I think I want to just work with not that. And so then anyway, lo and behold, people just kept coming, kept coming, kept coming. I'm like, okay, well, I guess this is I gotta welcome this because clearly I'm skilled at this. And I think that earlier stint for the 2 years at the clinic in a very traditional setting set me up, and then the disability case management really set me up to understand the way the world works when it comes to
Yeah.
helping people with pain. That was when fibromyalgia diagnoses were coming out, which is just like a lot of them were just get them out of my, like docs were like, get them out of my clinic, I'm just going to give you this label, get on with life kind of thing.
Yeah.
And yeah, I just I had a lot of understanding. I was still young, I had a lot of compassion, and it just sort of snowballed.
Yeah, I mean, because it is quite a challenging field to be in, pain management, chronic pain. It's quite challenging to have chronic pain. Is that what you're dealing with mostly, chronic pain? People who have, I mean, chronic pain here is often described as it's not very, you can't really diagnose why the person has the pain. There's multiple symptoms. It goes on for a long time. And they've usually been through the sort of ringer quite a lot with
Yeah.
approaches.
Yeah. And so my focus is I work with the folks who there's a persistency in their symptoms.
Mhm.
They've made some gain. They can get some relief, but it's not sustainable. And they're getting quite frustrated that
Yeah,
they can't get out of it.
yeah,
And those are the folks that I tend to work with because there's something that they're missing. I call it that they're working with surface level symptoms.
yeah.
So the things that are screaming at them and asking for attention. And so as we really recognize what those are, then they can start to recognize what are the contributing factors to those symptoms. And so they start to feel what I call the whispers. So they can listen to the whispers, and
Hmm.
they can tune into the whispers, and they don't actually have to hear the screams.
Okay.
And so, and I often will say too, it's not that like we're retraining neuromuscular patterns. And so there's a brain component to that, there's a body component to that, there's a belief component to that. And those three things really interweave really intimately together.
Yeah.
And there's a when I say there needs to be a readiness, it's not that I'm waiting for my client to be ready, but when those three things come together, you can be working at something for a little while, and then all of a sudden something flips, and it's like, aha, okay, I understand why this is happening. They say, and then they're on their way, right? So
Yeah.
there's that all three of those things come together.
There's a couple of questions I've got, which
Sure.
you may or not have answers to. One is there's the sense in which pain is a signal that says stop doing something. That's
Mm-hmm.
how it operates. So don't put your hand in the fire again because it hurt.
Yeah.
But pain in terms of movement
Yeah.
is complicated
Can
because
be.
if we are not moving, we will get pain.
Correct.
And if we move, sometimes that feels painful, but we have to be able to understand the difference between the two. That actually some
Correct.
forms of movement, even though they feel painful, will stop pain because we have to.
Correct.
But can you talk us through that a little bit? The other bit
Yeah.
I want to talk about is whether you work with chronic fatigue and things like that. But we'll come back to that if that's okay.
Sure.
What your thoughts are on that as well.
So the first piece that people really really need to get, and this is part of the belief piece of it,
Yeah.
is that there has been a long standing belief that if there's pain, there's something wrong.
Yes.
And there has
Yes.
been plenty of studies, huge numbers of studies, that will show that people can have a ton of pain and have no tissue damage at all in their body. They
That's
can also have no pain and have a ton of tissue damage in their body. So the way that I like to share it, and I say this to people and say, this is really good news with what I'm about to say, is that there's no correlation, or we can't make a correlation between the pain that you feel and the tissue damage, or not tissue, because there's not a correlation to
and
pain and tissue damage.
some limb pain, and there's no
Yeah.
limb, so
Yeah. Right. And what I say to them is, and that's okay. A lot of people initially are like, but there's got to be something wrong because I've got pain.
Yeah.
And so I say to them, probably. It's just that there's not tissue damage. And isn't that awesome that there's not tissue damage? Like the MRI, the CT, it's showing that there's no tissue damage, but there's got to be something. I'm like, maybe. And right now, with what we're seeing in the scan, there's not.
Yeah.
So then where I go to is and this is what I find really, really fun about my work is that when every human being compensates in their body movement, every single one. And what I mean by compensate is all our joints have a certain way of moving, and they have certain muscles that cause the movement. They have certain muscles that need to release for movement to happen. Like if I raise my arm, if I bend my elbow and bring my hand to my shoulder, the biceps need to contract, the triceps need to release, just as an example, right? If I kick a soccer ball, there's muscles on the front of my thigh that need to do something, and there's muscles in the back of my thigh that need to do something. So there's this that needs to happen. And all of us do something called compensate, which means other muscles are getting involved in a movement that aren't needed. So it can be classically someone grips through their jaw to do something, or they raise with their breath to do something. So that would be a compensation in the movement pattern. So everybody compensates. But here's the thing that I've found over the years, and that is people who have pain, when we help them reduce, not eradicate, but reduce their compensation patterns and get them moving in a better way. Remember that motor control and coordination. When we get the mechanism working better, when we get the coordination working better, their pain drops. And so there might not be any tissue damage, but the way that they're moving is better. And so the way that I've sort of made an assumption about why that's working is because now there's more proper connection between the way their brain and their body are connecting.
Yeah, exactly.
There's less extraneous movement, so there's less fatiguing, less energy drain.
Yeah.
And that seems to contribute to a reduction of pain.
When it comes to chronic fatigue in a minute, but I'm going to another little question about that, because you're not saying, I
Mhm.
think, and you correct me if I'm wrong, is that what we're talking about is a psychological problem that's manifesting. It's not somatic. It is physical, but there's something in the system that can be corrected. It's not necessarily damage, but it is, you've got these compensatory factors going on, and if you can work on better ways of moving, you will often find that that relieves and helps manage those symptoms that are real. Because I think there's often something with the, like you said earlier on, there's something about long-term chronic type pain where doctors just get fed up of all the scans, they can't find anything. So they then go, well, it must be inside your head. But it's not. It's
Mm-mm.
real. People are really experiencing it. And there's
Yep.
ways of relieving it. That's what I hear you saying, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so then what they learn as they recognize what these compensations, because the other thing to recognize is these compensations are not in our field of awareness. So we don't tend to be conscious of them. So then when our body is screaming at us and we go to the health professional and say, help me, help me, help me, they then deal with the symptoms. And so what I'm helping them recognize is we can work with the surface symptoms, but then we need to recognize these compensation patterns are often whispers. And when people can tune into what those feel like, now they can intervene at that level. And I sometimes will use the traffic light analogy. If someone hasn't been in a motor vehicle accident, then I'll use this traffic light analogy where the screams are like red, the whispers are yellow, and then they get to green. And so they start to be able to recognize when, kind of like through the day as we get hungry, that's like green going to yellow, right? So as they recognize their energy ebbing and flowing through the day, they recognize green going to yellow, and they start to tune in more to their self. And there's a lot of science growing now about this, the increasive need for self-awareness. And there's a term that's being used a lot now called interoception. And interoception really is our felt sense. And so most science says, think about your heartbeat or hunger or thirst. That's all you being interoceptively aware. Well, we can actually take that even further. And
Mm,
this is answering your question about there's the pain that's a problem, and then there's the pain that actually you need to work through. And
yes.
that's this an interoceptive awareness of tuning into, okay, which is the pain that's telling me to stop and which is the pain that's actually telling me to go. And
Yeah.
the thing that's important that people really, really have to recognize is no one can tell you which one is go and which one is stop. That's for
Yes,
you to
absolutely.
tune
That's right.
into.
Yes.
And
Yes.
when you tune into it and recognize it, you're off to the races. Like that, then you've got freedom, you've got empowerment, you've got the power, and you can really advocate and gain agency for yourself because you've got so much more
And that is really important because
internal control.
yeah, because we have a sort of, if you like, a health service in the
Yeah.
UK, and I presume in Canada,
Yep.
because you also have a funded health service as well. So similarities culturally, but you to get health services, you have to have a problem.
Mm-hmm.
Opposed to you can get health services without a problem.
Mm-hmm.
It's the ideal that we want health that promotes continuing health as opposed to
Yes.
health that treats illness. So it's a
Yes.
deficit-based model. So we're still in that relationship towards getting services for our problems. We want to be diagnosed. What's the deficit you're going to fix in me? And
Yes.
we make the deficit bigger and bigger to get the services that we need. And in the UK recently, there's been a change in government, and I'm not going to get into party politics, but the new incoming prime minister has said very clearly that the NHS has to change, and he said they has to do more preventative work, which is essentially that point. They have to become a health service, not an illness service,
Mm.
which is what it is at the moment. And it seems to me what you're advocating for is a health service
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
where people
Yeah.
are healthy and servicing their health and their needs. Coming to, can you say anything about chronic fatigue? Because we're having a lot of that now post COVID, with
Yes.
the post-viral syndrome. It's all chronic fatigue essentially. Chronic
Yeah.
fatigue is a particular diagnosis, but there's a whole range now because of COVID of
Yeah.
post-viral symptoms that are producing lots of physical pain and
Yes.
also this fatigue problem which interrupts and interferes with exercise, if you like, in the broadest sense, because of
Yeah.
the problem of inflammation and that type of response. Are you in that as well? Would you say anything about it in terms of what you're doing?
I don't work with a lot of people who have long COVID or who are post COVID in that way. I know a lot of colleagues who do work with those folks. And and what they will say is that whether it's the vaccination or whether it's the COVID itself, it revealed some other undercurrent state.
Okay.
And that undercurrent state is what's really bubbling up. And then like my acupuncturist colleagues, for example. And so then they start to work with that, which is bubbling up and help resolving that. And that's what their experience has been when they've seen that. I also had a colleague who developed COVID last fall, and he's a PT, he's a physical therapist. And he was relaying to me that he was having some trouble getting past sort of the zone 2 exercise.
Yeah, right. That's right. I mean, that's what you're thinking about is what the impact is there.
Yeah. And he had another colleague who does a lot of work in this field.
Yeah.
And was saying to him, when you look at your heart rate, and so he has a Garmin watch, and he could be able to watch his heart rate all the way through. And she said, are you noticing any of these like big spikes in your heart rate? Okay. And he kind of shows the data. He's like, kind of like that. And she says, yes, like that. She said, don't try to get past zone 2 until that settles out. She goes, nobody knows.
Right. Okay. Right.
Nobody knows what's happened. This is back in October. She's like, nobody knows why that's happening. Just don't try and push yourself. Because what they have found is that the type A'ers who have tried to push themselves past that point have actually got themselves into deeper trouble. And so then he just kind of stayed at zone 2. And then when those peaks kind of settled out, then he was able to get to zone 3. So there was something about what was happening with the heart and the heart rate as it related to COVID, or maybe some other conditions. I don't know. And the trouble is, but not everyone has trackers, right? Because I asked him, I said, could you tell when it spiked? Like, could you sensorily feel when it spiked? And he said, well, maybe there was like a sigh, but like it didn't really feel like anything. So so there's a lot of like internal states for people to really have to connect to that's important, it seems, for the healing process to occur.
And that message is really important, that sort of internal knowledge and learning how to understand yourself from that sort of perspective seems to be really crucial in this development.
And it's so tough too, though, because in talking with colleagues. So again, this is me getting secondhand information and talking with colleagues. And I mean, I remember when long COVID was coming around, and it can be so easy to get down on oneself, and it can be so easy to be upset with COVID, and it's being COVID's fault, right? And it can be very, very tricky.
Yes.
To kind of navigate, because I was a vibrant and bright person before all this, and I can't even get out of bed in the morning, right? And so it can feel like you're going, like you're walking through the muck of the forest, and it's getting deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper. And the folks that I know who have been working with acupuncture and Chinese medicine or the Indian form of medicine, Ayurveda, or some of these practices that help you to calm, and not that you need calming down, but it's like to help you settle a system, to help you kind of just shift up the way that you're physiologically responding to things, responding, like how your body is responding can make a fundamental difference in the outcomes.
We do need to settle down a lot more. I think we live in a culture that is too active. So thinking polyvagal, the active nervous system, and then relaxed nervous system. And we're not working with the relaxed nervous system again, which sort of segues us a little bit into, I hope, some of the yoga stuff and the breathing stuff and the relaxation stuff and the importance of that. And do you do much with polyvagal theory? Is that part of it?
I have it in the back of my mind. I remember reading some research about 10 years ago in the mindfulness realm that when we adopt a very curious mindset, we're more in a parasympathetic state. And when we're kind of this is the right way to do something, we're in much more in a sympathetic state. And then I was starting to read some of the polyvagal around like the collapsed state. And that made a lot of sense, right? So
frozen.
Right. And so how do we help facilitate and foster these spaces within ourselves and knowing that collapse it's a human response. So it's a physiological human response that can be effective, is how can we help facilitate in a healing state this place of a rest and digest for sure. Yeah. And help cultivate on the inside.
It's just really interesting, sort of like, and we were talking about it before, that in many ways we're learning what our grandparents knew, but
Yes.
they didn't need the evidence. And now we need the evidence, which is reasonable, because people are paying for services and stuff like that, and it's we're not here to sell snake oil. We're here to give people what we know works,
Mm-hmm.
evidence for it.
Mm-hmm.
But it is amusing, isn't it, in some ways, that we need to be told to relax, that there's evidence that says it's really useful to relax. I mean, sort of like, seriously, there's something
Yeah.
more about that.
I think if we got an anthropologist or some other social scientist, I'm sure they could give us all the reasoning over the decades from our grandparents to now about how that is evolved and just how much more stimulation there is. I think I was reading something about how my generation is one of the last generations before social, like who didn't grow up with social media,
Yeah, same. I didn't grow up
right?
with computers.
You
I
know,
know.
I didn't have social media. So
Yeah.
like my photo wasn't all over the place on Instagram and Facebook because my parents thought to share it. Right. Like it's a definitely a different era of stimulation that we've got to relearn where and how we sit amongst all that energy for sure.
But tell me about the yoga practice as well. And is it yoga nidra that you're particularly using? Is that right? So did I get that
So
right?
partly, yeah. So there's the first piece of it, which is the therapeutic aspects of yoga,
Yeah.
where I'm integrating the biomechanics and kinesiology. And then the yoga nidra piece is they call it yoga sleep. And you can do it anywhere. You can do it lying down, you can do it sitting in your sofa, really anywhere. And it's a very simple, some people will call it passive way of step by step down regulating, relaxing your system. And so it's a body scan, it's a breathing scan. It's really getting a feel for different ways of connecting this. That's not just lying on the couch doing those things. It's a very directed approach of being able to tune in, relax, and settle down.
Yeah. And is it using the breath and the mechanics
Yeah.
of the breath as well? So
Yeah.
walk us through the sort of breathing techniques. I probably know them, but just so that people who don't know them, what's the sort of basic breathing that you'd be asking people to do?
So really simply, when you're in a yoga nidra practice, it could simply be you're watching yourself inhale and exhale and noticing what's happening with your body as you breathe. And is your body filling with air? Like, where do you feel it? Your rib cage, your belly. And some people in some cases won't feel it because they're not tuned in.
Yeah.
So maybe that they just feel the air coming in through their nose and then out their nose. So
Yeah.
it's first of all just noticing that you are breathing. And then you might do what's called 3-part breath, where it's you imagine that you're filling the bottom of your belly,
Right.
then you're filling the top of your belly, and then you fill your chest, and then you relax. So it's those types of inhaling and exhaling practices that can be very settling. Also, lengthening your breath is another one. So if you count the number of counts it takes for you to inhale and count the number of counts it takes to exhale, then can you let that exhale lengthen by 1 count? Can you slow it down by 1 count?
Yeah.
And as you're doing that, everything can start to settle down.
Yeah. And so lengthening that breath, as far as I understand it, is activating the parasympathetic.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
In and out through the nose is quite important. Is that you ask people to breathe in and out through the nose when they can, I guess. But
yeah, if they don't have anything blocking their nose, yes. Yeah, I mean it's
old and I'm doing it with dog, forget.
It slows the breath, it warms the breath, warms the air that comes breath, it slows the breath down. It can filter some impurities in the air. Like, yeah, nose breathing is the way to go, really is the way to go. And we want to breathe. So if someone has to start off with mouth breathing and then find their way towards nose breathing, that is that's the way in is the way in. And then the refinement can happen.
But ideally we want to be using the nose breathing, is that right?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. And my understanding is as well is that part of that is because the vagus nerve runs around the back of the nose and down the back of the throat. So you're actually more directly stimulating it by doing that. Is that,
you know what? I haven't heard that specifically. I know that when we are consciously breathing, especially when we're doing a slower mindful breath through the nose, I mean it clicks off all the physiological markers, better metabolism, lower blood pressure, lower heart rate. Like it's all those physiological markers that are associated with rest and relaxation start to increase. Yeah.
And again, it's biological evidence that
Yeah.
breathing through our nose is much more successful in terms of regulating how we breathe, but also regulating how our body works, so that we're in a much more
Yes.
natural state of up, down,
Yes.
up, down. And also, often I will say to people, I wonder what you think about this. Breathing in and out through the mouth is really about panting, and it's really about suggesting that we're in a state of danger of some sense,
Hmm.
because we pant when we need to really oxygenate because we're in fight flight. And really, we want to keep those two things separate and
Hmm.
save your mouth breathing to when the saber-toothed tiger is there, is my advice. Otherwise,
Yeah.
use your nose.
Yeah.
And
That's
so, in
great.
terms of yoga nidra, because it is quite interesting, do you use props to help people
Oh,
support
yes.
them?
Yeah. I mean, ultimately, we want to create what we often call as a yoga nidra nest. So we
Okay,
want to get cozy. We want to get comfortable, whatever really is needed, whether you're lying on your back or your side or you're sitting, you want to find the place that's comfortable. In most practices, people will say, okay, before we carry on, how can you be 10 to 15% more comfortable? Like, how can you really get cozy here? And when supportive, whatever that means for the person.
right. And so, the importance of this, as I understand it, it's not necessarily the practice, but the practice gives you the capacity to learn how to down regulate and to relax and to manage distressed and stressed states. Is that correct?
Yeah, and you're not that you're trying to stay alert. It's not that you're trying. Sometimes people do fall asleep in the practice, and
Yeah.
in my mind, that means that they actually need sleep. So that's fine. When you get as you get more skilled with it, you're staying alert to all these physiological shifts that are happening in your body and noticing where your brain goes. And it's all very, even though it's passive, meaning it's being done to you, there's very much a lot of activity that you're doing in terms of your alertness and engagement. So then it's more easily take that out into the real world as an engaged practice. Like it transitions really well to then when you're driving, you can be that much more aware and
I
in
was going to
tune.
ask, you can do it while you're driving, like you can with mindfulness?
Yeah. So what you realize from the practice becomes like you can integrate that. I wouldn't do yoga nidra while you're in the
No,
car,
no, no,
but you
no.
can take what you've realized into the practice. So
That
I've found that when
awareness.
I'm in a particularly loaded psychological space, I can do some yoga nidras and it just gives me another way to respond.
Yeah,
Right. It boosts my engines or my battery. So I've
yeah.
got a greater bandwidth for response.
And what I found when I was learning, this is a long time ago, when I was learning sort of mindful breathing and mindful practice, that initially when I was doing it, I had to be in a specific way, a specific state, because it was foreign. But actually, now I can be mindful in what I'm doing, no matter what I'm doing. I can add elements
Absolutely.
of it, not fully mindful maybe, but I bring in elements of it and I know that it's contributing. I'm guessing it's something similar to that as well is going on with the practice.
Oh yeah. I mean, you can like I've done the yoga nidra when I feel awesome. I've done yoga nidra when I feel very mad. I can do it when I'm feeling very sad, right? I think the only thing I might not do it is I'm really tired and I'm not able to be alert, then I'll like just go to sleep or have
Yeah.
a nap. But other than that, yeah, you can utilize it and then take the principles from it um and apply it into your life because you just got that much more bandwidth.
And it
I think the other
sounds
piece that's
like it fits into that sort of traffic light idea as well.
yeah.
Rather than because the equivalent of red here is the overwhelm state, isn't it?
Yes. Hmm.
And you can actually get into the nidric state, if that's the correct term, or that aware, relaxed state, as you seem to be
Yes.
describing it, in long before you get into the overwhelm.
There
And
you go.
you're going, oh, I'm yellow. Let's get nidric about this. I don't know what the correct term is. You tell me. But let's get aware of relaxing and managing myself, managing stimulation, and bring myself more into green.
Yeah, and I think the other piece of it is where yoga nidra is getting a lot of research now too is in this aspect of really like being solid about your recuperative practices. And we don't tend to think about rest. We tend to think about watching Netflix or watching like binge watching things, and those can be relieving in some way, but they're not actually recuperative. And I don't want to pull that that hobby from somebody. And it's also important to recognize what's actually helping you find rest. Also, particularly if you're having trouble sleeping, if you happen to have a poor sleep, like I think about when I had my kids early on, there were plenty of nights that I wasn't sleeping through the night.
Yeah.
And so having a Nidra practice during the day helped increase my bandwidth again. And so we know that sleep is vital. And if you're someone who's having difficulty sleeping, Nidra can come in and be that extra little space. I've also found for myself, when there's been particularly heightened scenarios that have been going on within my world,
Yeah.
that I might not realize initially that I'm wired. And then I have trouble falling asleep. And it's like, oh, interesting. This is not normal for me. Usually I just fall asleep and it's not a big deal. But I'm having trouble falling asleep.
Yeah.
And then I recognize, I'm like, oh, look at me. I'm a little wired.
Mm.
And so then coming into a practice like a Nidra practice can help take the edge off the wiredness, which then enables the falling asleep and
Really,
often will
really.
lead to a deeper sleep and a
Yeah.
more REM sleep
Yeah.
throughout the night. Yeah.
And also because there's that thing, particularly when somebody's slightly insomniac, they get very anxious
Yeah.
and bed becomes an uncomfortable, anxious place. Whereas if you
Yep.
can, rather than I'm going to sleep, what I'm going to do is I'm going to relax consciously and I'm still going to be okay about that, which is, I guess, what you're promoting.
Yep.
Then you're still doing something that's really physiologically very important for you. And you're not turning your bed into an uncomfortable, difficult place that then you start to get
Yep.
into a sort of vicious cycle around it. We are
Exactly.
sort of like at the end of the show, unfortunately.
Mhm.
I just want to come back to something about and just describe to me, if you will, and I want to tell people why I've invited Susie on. I've invited Susie on because there's a massive evidence now about the role of activity and relaxation in life and the importance of both of those things. And you said something really important about we don't often think about recovery time. And that's true in any exercise regime. People forget that you need recovery time. Like I've got a Garmin watch. I don't realize this. It tells me today you're going to recover. Today you're going to rest because you're not healthy unless you have those days, unless you have
Yep.
those times. So that's really, really important. But I'm interested in the therapeutic yoga as well. So the yoga nidra is the balancing, if you like. We've got the activity and we've got the non-activity, but we're still
That's right.
we're not overwhelmed.
That's
Tell me
right.
about the sort of the therapeutic yoga and the management that you're doing with people around pain. And we've got a couple of minutes to jump into that, and
Sure.
then you have to stop us.
Yeah, no, for sure. And that it's really combining what we know about biomechanics and anatomy into therapeutic aspects of yoga. So we think about yoga poses. We're not doing yoga poses, but rather how does someone move that close to those poses? But how does someone move in a way that is biomechanically helpful for them, that supports their tissue, and helps reduce their pain? And then combining that with how can we help grow your awareness that much more and build up your recuperative battery so that you do have the greater ability to move more and do more. And so when you get, it's kind of like an ebb and a flow.
Yeah.
We want to have both. We want to have like the waves come up, the waves come down. You're active and you rest, and learning how to integrate those aspects into your life, because those really are key tickets for not only reducing pain, but having pain eradicate for a long time.
And the interesting thing for me about yoga is that, I mean, one can think about it in terms of isometrics and body weight stuff,
Yeah.
that it's not using external weights and it's not used resistance and those techniques. It may do in some forms,
Mhm.
but actually, if you think about the research around isometric holds, for example, having
Mhm.
a much better impact upon your heart functioning than going for a fast run, literally.
Mhm.
So
It
there's been
can.
research that's been produced in the UK
Mhm.
recently that has shown that isometric holds in terms of cardiovascular function is much healthier for you than running.
Mhm. It could be. Yeah, that's really cool to know.
Really
Yeah.
new research that's coming out.
Yeah.
And I think of yoga in that type of practice as well. There's lots of flow and movement, but there's also stopping and holding.
Yes.
And it seems to me that's very important, you know. And also,
Mhm.
as an older guy, there's active stretching, which for me is crucial for my health, uh,
Hmm.
and keeps me mobile, rather than that muscle sort of power
Hmm.
off, which is okay. I do that as well. But this sort of active stretching that I get from yoga, I always feel great about that. And I'm
Hmm.
wondering about that and your understanding of that in terms of the practice and what you're doing with people therapeutically.
All of the above. Because depending on who the person is, somebody will need the holds, somebody will need more specific mobility work, somebody will need like there's different aspects of it. So a lot of the yoga you're referring to is more. I want to don't want to say it's more advanced, but it's more if you've got more of the fundamental movement patterns and there's not a lot of pain, that tends to be the practices that are helpful for people. Whereas for me, I'm helping people get to that point.
Okay, right.
Right. So it just depends on where someone's at in the cycle.
Okay. But
Yeah.
it's not fundamentally going to hurt them in, say, if somebody
Hmm.
goes down the gym and tries to pick up a weight. Uh,
Ah, no.
yeah. So
No.
we have run out of time. Have you just produced a book? Is that right? No, it's not you, it's
Hmm.
somebody else. But tell us, have you got a website? Have you got
Yeah.
social media? How do people contact you? How do they book you? What services, etc.? Go on, go.
Right, for sure. So people can find me over at functionalsynergy.com and on the socials. I'm from pain to possibility. I've got a podcast from pain to possibility. Over on YouTube from pain to possibility, and we've got movement practices there. We've got breathing and Nidra practices there, so people can kind of consume all that over there if they want to kick my tires and see if what I've got working for them. Same thing over on Facebook. Same thing. I did a lot of video filming during pandemic,
Yeah.
so lots of that is still there for people to be able to consume. And then all of my private one-to-one sessions are in 3 months because it takes not just one time to help people get someone
No,
out of
of
pain,
course
but
not.
it's a retraining process. And they can just find me there through my website at
And
Functional
are you
Synergy.
training other professionals, other yoga
Mhm.
teachers, and
That's
other?
right.
You've got courses for them to join into?
Yes. Yeah. So I train health professionals and yoga teachers in the
Right.
work that I do, and they integrate that to
Super.
their practice.
Absolutely super. Thank you so
Yeah.
much, Susie, for coming on.
You bet.
I
Thank you.
really appreciate the fact that you gave me a second chance because I sort of feel really bad about that last week. Really wonderful to have you on. You stay there while I say goodbye to folk. I can't stress enough how important it is to begin to engage with these things because I can tell you from a psychological perspective, there's no difference between mind and body. They have to work together and they are the same thing. There is no distinction. And the more you can work with yourself and your perception of your body, how you feel, your relationships with other people, your relationships with your food, your sleep, start working with those and learning about them as much as possible. And you will find that you will function much better. Absolutely, without doubt. And Susie and people like Susie are an absolute gift to us, and we should use them as much as possible. Thanks so much for joining us. I hope you all enjoyed that. And I'll see you all and at the next time. Remember, send me a message on 07 506 319 745. So bye bye for now.